We'll get started in just a minute. Well, good morning and welcome to City Club Missoula's January Forum. Happy New Year, everybody. We are recording this forum. I'm Susan Hay Patrick, Chair of the City Club Missoula Board of Directors, and delighted to see you all, or not see you, but know that you are all here. City Club's mission is to bring people together to inform and inspire them on issues vital to the community through forums like this that encourage the discussion of new ideas and the free exchange of thought. We have a deep commitment to civility and civil discourse, things that I haven't given up hope for, even in these very challenging times. And I haven't given up hope for preserving, protecting, defending, and learning from the natural world, which is why I'm excited, and our board is excited to have 3 world-class experts with us today talking on these topics. Before I introduce our moderator, Nick Mott, also world-class, some thank yous, as always, to the University of Montana for giving us their Zoom platform, and Alex Karklins at UM for making these forums possible for us. Also to Missoula Community Access Television, which tapes our forums as part of their media assistance grants to nonprofit organizations. MCAT serves the community on cable channels 189 and 190. And you can also find videos of past City Club forums by going to our website, cityclubmissoula.com, and clicking the video button. We are always grateful to our sponsors, especially our executive level sponsors, Blackfoot and First Security Bank. We also like to highlight other sponsors every month. So today we want to recognize Missoula County, which has a snazzy new logo I see on the slide, Glacier Country Tourism, and Morrison Merrily. We are very grateful for our diverse sponsors, and we invite you to join them by going to our website, cityclubmissoula.com. Also, thank you, of course, to the City Club Board and our administrator, Eric Legvold. I will see you again at the break when it's your opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A format. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Nick Mott. Nick is a journalist and podcast producer. He produces the Peabody Award-winning show Threshold and the Montana Public Radio production Richest Hill, which the New Yorker magazine named one of the best podcasts of 2019. Nick also reports principally on the environment and natural resource issues for MTPR. His work has been featured in the Washington Post, Outside, Kaiser Health News, Reveal, and just about any NPR show you can think of. Nick is based in Livingston and reports that he is excited for us to get some more snow. So welcome and thank you, Nick.
Thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be here, and it's weird to be talking in my microphone where people can actually see me, but it's really nice. I'm excited for this event. I'm just going to get straight to it. We have 3 really, really amazing panelists today. So as you listen, think about questions you have for them, either individually or for all 3, and feel free to post those in the Q&A tab, and I'll keep track and we'll get those in at the end. But to start off, our first speaker is Dr. Jakki Mohr. She is the Regents Professor of Marketing, the Poe Distinguished Faculty Fellow, and Fellow at the Institute of Ecosystems at the University of Montana. She received her Ph.D. in marketing from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In another life, she actually worked in Silicon Valley at Hewlett-Packard. Jakki's most recent research is situated at the intersection of the natural world and business. She studies innovations in the field of ecological restoration, like restoring degraded landscapes, and how companies use biomimicry, or innovations inspired by nature and based on underlying biological mechanisms to solve technical and engineering challenges. Her teaching and scholarship have won all kinds of awards, and she was even in 2018 named Montana Teacher of the Year. So Jakki, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Nick. I'm really excited to be here today. I have been fascinated with biomimicry ever since I heard Janine Benyus, who is the author of a book, Biomimicry Innovations Inspired by Nature, in about 2010. So about 10 years. Let's go ahead and dive in and learn about some of these innovations. First of all, some quick definitions. Biomimicry is the practice of learning from nature to solve design problems, where design essentially refers to product design and product development. And as a marketing professor, product development and innovation is a fundamental function of marketing. The word biomimicry can be broken into two components. Bio stands for biology, or things that refer to life or living things. And of course, the word mimic means to copy. And what we see is that nature has had 3.8 billion years of evolution to evolve very effective and efficient shapes, forms, processes, and materials. And therefore, biomimicry seeks creative inspiration from these lessons in nature using a thoughtful, systematic approach to these insights. A little bit more background on biomimicry is that it did start in Missoula, Montana. I've mentioned the book featured on the right, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature, by author Janine Benyus, who is a graduate of the University of Montana. She and her colleagues have started multiple organizations, including Biomimicry 3.8, which is a consulting group headquartered here in Missoula. The Biomimicry Institute is an educational nonprofit arm focused on providing teaching materials to educators at all levels. Ask Nature is an open source website where people can go and find lessons from nature. And if you're interested in training, the Biomimicry Group also has started a professional pathways program to earn a professional certification in biomimicry. Let's go ahead and look at some examples now. And the way that I've structured these examples is to think about the problems that we, through our own human engineering, have created. This is a fairly common sight across the Western United States, where we have these fairly rectangular shaped locomotives going through a variety of tunnels. And certainly in the Western United States, we're not necessarily worried about the impacts of these locomotives in the urbanscape or in urban areas. But if you do live in an urban area, there are high-speed trains both in Japan and Europe. And high-speed trains, when they go through a tunnel with these blunt-edged locomotives, disturb the air, which creates a sonic boom when they exit those tunnels. And these sonic booms obviously are very distressful to people who live in these metro areas. The Tokyo metro area has 17 million people. And a solution to these sonic booms was required by the people of Japan. And the engineer of the bullet train in Japan happened to be a birder. And when he was out one day in nature observing the kingfisher, which we also have here in Western Montana, and we see them fishing along the Rattlesnake Creek, for example, they are able to enter the water in a very aerodynamic fashion. And it seems perhaps somewhat obvious in hindsight that mimicking the form of this aerodynamic shape would be logical. So the bullet train in Japan, called the Shinkansen, actually changed the shape of the locomotives to have this aerodynamic form. And this change in shape did solve the problem of creating sonic booms because it displaced the air in the tunnel in a more streamlined fashion. And as importantly, it actually generated increased fuel efficiency because of that aerodynamic shape. The second example that I'll be focusing on is, again, a common problem that we see here in the Western United States when we go camping in the month of June. Typically, it's very wet, and we want waterproofing materials, not only on our tents and our backpacks, but on our jackets and our gear. And the common engineered solution to waterproofing is to create materials that are made of fossil fuels, such as petroleum, that the chemical intensive nature is actually quite toxic. And biomimic would actually solve the problem of waterproofing by asking the question, how does nature waterproof? What we see in this slide on the lower left is a picture of the lotus leaf. And you'll note that the water molecules bead up automatically. And this beading effect is due to the underlying molecular structure of the lotus leaf that, when it's magnified here in the main image that you see, has a rough, bumpy surface. And we know the chemical properties of water molecules is such that they do bead up when they can find each other and attract each other. The material fabric that you see on the upper right mimics this underlying bumpy structure in the molecular surface of the fabric to create an automatic waterproofing effect. And this has been mimicked by several companies, one of which is Green Shield, which uses this lotus effect to create a non-toxic waterproofing material in outdoor gear. This is an example of materials that are inspired by nature. The third example that I would like to use is inspired by the termite mound, which we don't have here in Montana, but is a not uncommon thing to see in arid desert regions. The termite mound has a unique tunneling structure that creates an airflow that allows it to maintain a constant ambient air temperature of 31 degrees Celsius, which is 87 Fahrenheit. And when we think about the need for air conditioning in these desert environments, an architect who built the Eastgate building in Harare, Zimbabwe, mimicked the unique tunneling structure observed in the termite mound. And this building uses 90% less energy for air conditioning than a conventional building. So based on these simple examples, I'd like to highlight that the benefits of biomimicry are that they are more energy efficient. Nature has to use energy sparingly. I haven't used an example to highlight the using less materials, but again, nature is very efficient in how it combines materials. The examples that I've highlighted show the performance benefits of nature-inspired design. In addition, nature-inspired designs tend to be environmentally friendly. They are non-toxic. And one thing that I'll be talking about in a slide or two based on my research is that employees who work at companies that are using nature-inspired design or biomimicry tend to have greater satisfaction levels. And we know this is important because employee turnover can be very costly, and employee morale is a very important attribute that motivates employees to work at their best. Now, biomimicry is not without its challenges. Companies and product designers do find it difficult to understand and translate the language of biology. Business people typically are not trained as biologists. And companies that are trying to integrate biomimetic design into their innovations find that the product design process can take longer than what they're used to. Biomimicry also requires that companies make changes in their product development practices. There are metrics that they use for success. I mentioned the timeline already, and teams now oftentimes include a biologist as part of the product development team. So these changes, companies are not very good at changing the approach that they use in the organizational environment. My research has occurred over a 10-year time span with two co-authors that you see listed here. Linda Price is currently at the University of Wyoming, and Eric Reinfleisch is at the University of Illinois. We have studied 15 companies over a 10-year time period to learn about their trajectory in attempting to harness the voice of nature to use biomimicry to develop sustainable innovation. My research has been featured in 2 TEDx talks, one in Bozeman and one in San Diego. And you can see more complete examples and illustrations from my research in those talks. What I'd like to focus on today, based on my research, are some of the success factors for companies that are successfully leveraging biomimicry for product innovation. You'll see that there are 5 success factors listed here. And before I go through these success factors, I'd like to highlight that interface floor is one of the shining success stories of leveraging biomimicry. Interface floor makes industrial carpeting. And again, this historically has been a petroleum-based fabric that is very toxic. And Interface sought inspiration from the random patterns found in a forest floor. And by making carpeting more random, they were able to replace only portions of the carpet that were worn out or spilled on, instead of in an office building, have to rip out a large amount of carpet that might have been stained by a coffee spill or worn because of traffic patterns. By only reducing the areas that were damaged, they could save on a lot of the expense and the waste of replacing large amounts of carpet that were still functional, but perhaps the dye lots were different. So moving to this randomness created not only beauty, but also efficiency. And the common success factors for companies that are harnessing biomimicry is that they do invest in training on biology in their teams. Not that the business people need to become biologists, but having a shared appreciation for this language of biology is a critical success factor. This investment oftentimes requires the support and vision of the top leadership. And in fact, at Interface Floor, Ray Anderson was deeply inspired by Janine Benyus in his conversations with her, and wanted his company to be a company that was more environmentally sustainable. As part of this, the company has invested heavily in a brand or market position on sustainability for the environment. And the values and beliefs that are part of the organizational culture is also one that respects environment for both lessons and learning, as well as mitigating environmental impacts. Finally, a long-term focus is critical. Our economic environment definitely prioritizes short-term earnings, particularly based on the stock market, and companies that are willing to take a longer-term focus that is associated with success in using biomimicry. For those of you who are interested in learning more, there are a number of books that are available in addition to Janine Benyus's books. And I have a picture from just one of my shelves in my bookcase here, including the shark's paintbrush, learning from the octopus. There are a whole host of videos and podcasts that you can find if you search on Google. There are workshops. The Biomimicry Institute here in Missoula has a number of very insightful and interesting trainings. And at a minimum, I recommend that you sign up for the newsletter from the Biomimicry Institute. So in conclusion, as you think about the problems that we face in our world today, I urge you to start with the question, how would nature do that? We may find insights from nature that are relevant to addressing many of the challenges that we see in our world today. I'll pass it back to you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was wonderful. If we were in person and not on Zoom, there'd be all kinds of applause right now. So just imagine it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, don't forget to post questions. There's already plenty of things percolating in my mind right now in the Q&A box as we proceed in these presentations. But I'll just get right on with it. Our next presenter is Dave Noggle. He is a professor in the wildlife biology program at the University of Montana. And for more than a decade, he served as science advisor to the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, providing science support for Farm Bill conservation programs. And as science advisor, his work has resulted in on-the-ground conservation on millions of acres across the West, along with unprecedented conservation partnerships. He was also part of a monumental collaborative effort to keep the sage grouse off the endangered species list. If you've heard anything about that bird, you've probably heard about its elaborate mating ritual and stuff like that. It's also an ecosystem indicator for the sagebrush steppe across the West. And he continues to provide science support to the NRCS, launching new initiatives to increase conservation on private lands. So go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Nick. Coming to you live from a spare bedroom in the South Hills. Sorry about Zoom. My wife tells me that I have a face for radio. But seriously, it's nice to be with you today. I'm going to center my comments around 3 life lessons that nature's taught me. The first one is that nature knows no boundaries. Nature never asks permission to cross the fences that we erect. Number 2 is that people are part of nature, not separate from it. And because people perceive nature in their own way, each holds sacred their ideas about how to best conserve it. And then thirdly, conserving nature requires us to get our hands dirty. Writing good policy is one thing, but actually fixing what is broken is another entirely. So let's talk first about nature knowing no boundaries. Now close your eyes and think about nature. Come on, play along with me. We're all one family here for an hour and a half. Think about nature. When people think about nature, it conjures up memories of personal experiences. Maybe a summer float trip through CMR refuge near Lewistown, a camping trip in Glacier, or that once in a lifetime fishing trip that you finally took into the Scapegoat. People feel like part of nature in these public lands. It is part of what makes public land ownership special. But now let's shift gears. I'm betting that few of you gave much thought to private lands, like the Barthelmess Ranch on the High Line north of Malta, or the livestock operation managed by the Rath family near Roundup, north of Billings. Yet these are some of the most productive lands in all of Montana, and they are privately owned and managed, as is 70% of all the land in the Treasure State. People's almost singular focus on public lands has always fascinated me. Because in truth, it's the melding of public and private lands that together support the greatest pronghorn migration in the world, from Saskatchewan to Montana's Missouri River breaks and back again. and the longest sage grouse movements ever documented, spanning 230 miles round trip annually. The unsung hero in this story is the private rancher, who deserves a pat on the back for their contribution to nature's boundlessness. So here's my hope for the future of nature. That private lands conservation is entering a long-awaited renaissance period. And it will be incumbent upon us to innovate big enough and fast enough to meet the challenge. Now let's return to my second life lesson. Remember, people are part of nature, not apart from nature. I'm science advisor for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Sage Grouse Initiative, or the acronym is SGI, a private lands partnership through the Farm Bill designed to bolster conservation on Western working ranches. SGI's worked with more than 2,000 ranch families across 11 states to conserve or enhance the equivalent of, in size, to 4 Yellowstone national parks. But these are all private working lands that support both nature and people. Participation is as high in SGI now as it was a decade ago when we first launched the idea. If you take one message home from me today, it's this: the recipe for scaling up the conservation of nature on private lands is different from that of public lands. And we are continually learning from one another and innovating in real time. I hope someday universities to be teaching private lands conservation in mainstream curriculums. Envision this: degree requirements could include an internship where students for a summer go and live on a working ranch to learn to think more like their future clientele. That's how we'll win. SGI's shared vision for a decade has been wildlife conservation through sustainable ranching. This way, ranchers see themselves as part of the solution. It may seem crazy to you, but this is a radically new approach to ranchers who live in fear of the Endangered Species Act and for generations have been villainized by the domestic grazing of livestock. I want to wrap up my comments by recalling my third life lesson from nature. Recall, conserving nature requires us to get our hands dirty. By now, you're wondering, okay, what kind of conservation are we talking about? Put a little meat on the bone. Our time is short together, so I'll give you one example. 100 years of Smokey the Bear has put an end to natural fire regimes in the West, enabling pinyon juniper woodlands to expand by millions of acres into native sagebrush grazing lands. Just 2 to 3 trees per acre. Sage grouse that evolved in open landscapes abandoned tree-infested grazing lands. You can't write policy to stop a tree from growing in the wrong place. So SGI gets its hands dirty by cost sharing with ranchers the early removal of these expanding trees. A science-based evaluation by my group at UM shows that grouse populations increased by 12% just 3 years after cutting, in comparison to a nearby watershed where treatments were not applied. Ranchers benefit equally as perennial forage plants return where expanding trees had shaded them out. In voicing his opinion after ridding his ranch of encroaching trees, John O'Keefe, former head of the Oregon Cattlemen's Association near Adel, Oregon, told reporters, quote, "What's good for the bird is good for the herd." And that motto has stuck ever since. Reflecting back, SGI started in 2010 in response to the sage grouse's designation as a candidate for potential listing as an endangered species. In 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the species no longer warranted an endangered listing edict, citing the unprecedented efforts of SGI 43 times in the published Federal Register. Now, in 2021, ranchers participate in SGI out of pride instead of out of fear. In closing, I propose the conservation of private lands as a way to embrace nature's bounty as our own. We simply must get there as a society, if for no other selfish reason than our own species' prosperity. And so I'll leave you with a 1930s quote from the father of modern conservation, Aldo Leopold, who told us, "Conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest." I really enjoy being here with City Club today, and I'll turn it back to Nick.
Thank you so much. Once again, let's imagine that applause, or actually give some too if you want, but we'll imagine it over here. That was really, really fascinating and wonderful. When I closed my eyes and thought about nature, I certainly was thinking about public land. And when I was just out of college, actually, this would have been almost a decade ago now, I was removing pinions and junipers on sagebrush land. So definitely hits home with me. But let's move over to Doug. So Doug Chadwick is a wildlife biologist and a writer. After studying mountain goat biology atop the crown of the continent for 7 years, he turned to writing from a remote cabin on the edge of glacier without utilities. And that writing has taken him all over the globe, from Siberia to the Great Barrier Reef. He's written hundreds of articles and is a regular contributor to National Geographic. In fact, he had an article just last week that I'm sending to everybody right now about working dogs who are using their noses to sniff out wildlife. He's also authored over 14 books, and his upcoming book, which I'm very excited for, is called 4/5 a Grizzly, a new perspective on nature that just might save us all. So go ahead and take it from here.
Thank you. You can hear me okay. I like David's idea about closing your eyes and envisioning nature. And Nick, you picked up on that. So for right now, close your eyes and imagine you're in the headwaters of the Congo. And it's a lowland tropical forest. It is so thick, you really are using machetes. It's like all those grade B movies you've seen of slashing your way through the jungle, and you're with a group of Aka pygmies. And you're running into lowland gorillas and chimpanzees that have never seen humans before. And this is getting to know what nature can teach us by getting to know what nature is. And in the case of the Congo, when we met these groups of primates, of fellow apes, I was studying them, I was trying to learn about them, and they were doing exactly the same thing with us. Having never seen humans before, they spent hours in a meeting with us, inspecting us, scrutinizing us. We share 98% of the same genes with chimpanzees, a little bit less with gorillas, but they were trying to figure us out while we were trying to figure them out. And I couldn't see much difference. It was more like anthropology. It was more like a meeting of different tribes than biology. But mostly it was being just immersed in this place and focused solely on them. So if you can literally take a dive from there, go through the roaring 40s down into the furious 50s, south of New Zealand, and you're in the subantarctic. And you're among the Auckland Islands, where the right whales that spend this Antarctic summer in Antarctica, in the Antarctic waters, this is where they come to spend their Antarctic winter. And I saw some a ways away, and I jumped in the water in a dry suit with snorkel gear. And I thought I might get a glimpse of them underwater. And the visibility was pretty awful, but they found me. And I just turned around, underwater, and all of a sudden I've got 4 60 to 80 ton creatures coming to study me. And I remember an eye the size of my computer going slowly by and inspecting me. I was kind of honored. I felt like a bug on a leaf that a human went down to inspect. And I thought, wow, maybe I'm somebody. I'm at least interesting to this giant creature, the greatest, along with the blue whale, ever created. And the other thing I thought was, I'm running out of air. I need to get up to the surface. And I tried to go up and I couldn't, because there was the tail of an 80-ton whale on my head. And I tried to push it off. I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing I've ever done, is try to push an 80-ton whale off my head. But if it had flicked its tail, I wouldn't be here probably talking to you, but it didn't. And in addition to getting studied, I got what? I got tolerated by this creature, which I was stupid. It has a brain 2 to 3 times the size of a human's. It lives for at least a human lifespan. Its nearest relative, the bowhead, lives for 200 years or more. And I don't know what it was thinking, but I'm glad it was thinking, and it was interested in me, and it figured out what to do without harming me. I guess what I want to get at is there's ways to study nature. There's ways to do natural history studies. We're in an era of very sophisticated new technology to study nature at a molecular level, and it's increasing exponentially. And then there's just immersion in nature, and just be there and get us good tidings. And I wanted to let people know that if you lived in Japan or South Korea, you can get your health insurance will cover you for instruction and sessions of forest bathing. And that, of course, has nothing to do with getting wet. It's called Shinrin Ryoku in Japanese, and it's immersing yourself in a green space and absorbing it through all of your 5 senses and whatever those ineffable other senses you have are. Why does health insurance cover it? Why did I feel so much at home in a lowland tropical jungle? We're built for this stuff. It gets back to our relation with nature. We're a 350,000-year-old species, Homo sapiens, but our hominid ancestors have been living in these kinds of environments for 4 to 5 million years. It shaped our nerves. It shaped the way our thought patterns work. It shaped our reflexes, our endocrine system, our glands, our moods, how we know things. We're built for being in this kind of environment. And when you go there and you do a little forest bathing, or you just go outside, and thank God we live in Montana, there's never a far away to a forest or a wild place. Your blood pressure drops, your heart rate slows, your immune system gets boosted, gets activated. And let me just double check. It's a long list of things, but your cortisol and your adrenaline levels, your fight or flight hormones decrease, and your rest and restoration kind of system, your parasympathetic system is what it is dominant. You get healthier. There's no argument about it. This has all been measured by studies both in the Orient and in the UK and the US. It's just what happens because we are built to respond that way. And that brings up the fact that, okay, we're 350,000 years old, but we as hominids have been around since civilizations so-called started about 7,000 years ago. That's 0.0001% or something of our time on Earth as hominids, of what shaped us. As late as 1800, 3% or less of humanity lived in urban areas, subject to crowding, to incredible amounts of stimulation, strangers everywhere, structures that we, at some level, are unfamiliar to us. And on top of that, there's studies by the US Health Services to show that the average American now spends 87% of his or her life in an enclosed space, in a building, office, and 6% in addition in an enclosed form of transportation, namely your car, but whatever other kind. That's 93% of our existence in an environment that we are not fully adapted to by any means, and in a lifestyle that, I mean, how alive do you feel when you're out in nature? It's because everything's working and you're exercising, and you get a lot of those same benefits I mentioned just from physical exercise, but also just by looking at a picture of nature, at a green space, by sitting in a garden. And again, that's been measured. So the question is, what nature can teach us is to ask the question, are the environments we're creating for ourselves, is this really progress? And what are they doing to us? And the stress levels of constant stimulation, and so you could call it overstimulation. There's a reason I think that a quarter of the US population suffers anxiety and depression at some level. And these are coming out of the National Health Service. And they say it's a quarter, it could be more like a third if you assume how many people don't report that condition. But it's just, again, is what we're calling progress taking into account our relationship with nature, and as David said, the fact that we are nature, that we're not separated from it. In fact, it built us and made us what we are. How old are we really? Well, mammals have been around for 150 million years. But we not only share that 98% of our genes with chimps, but the genes we contain, a lot of them started back when everybody was one cell big in the world. That was the biggest that was. And on through. So it's not surprising that we share 80 to 90% of our genes with all mammals, from mice to great whales, 60 to 70% with the other vertebrates, fish, reptiles, birds, 40% with some insects, 20% with roundworms, 30% with some plants. I'm like a 30% rutabaga, and 7% with bacteria. The first, earliest, and supposedly most primitive forms, although they're not. But so in a sense, I'm alive in every creature out there. I swim, I fly, I open my petals, I slither, I blossom. I mean, it's another way of looking at nature and of what you're made of, the genes you carry and the things that they do. And yet we do pride ourselves as individuals. We think of ourselves as separate from nature. Look, we're an aggressive, territorial primate, a great ape we are very competitive. Our place in a hierarchical dominance social system is very important. How we're perceived, who we are, but what are we really made of? Nothing that makes us separate. So, Jackie, you mentioned termites. And the first thing I thought was we all know that termites and ants are among the most successful critters in the world. And most people know that termites don't actually digest the wood that they live on. It's done by a protozoan in their gut, a partnership, a joint venture, a symbiosis. But it's actually not true. It's bacteria that live on the cell walls of the protozoans in the termite's gut. That's what's doing the digesting of the wood. Let's go to an acacia tree in East Africa. And you may have lions lying in the shade and a giraffe feeding 20 feet up in it. But there's ants everywhere in that acacia, the other great superorganism, social insect. And there are special thorns, bigger than usual, on that acacia that are hollow, and that is for the ants to nest in. And there are special yummy parts on the leaves called nectaries that the tree produces for the ants to feed on. And that's because with the ants there, they are busy defending that acacia against leaf eaters. And then they find out on the bottom of those ants' feet are special little crenulations that house bacteria. Those bacteria put out antifungal and antimicrobial compounds that the ants track across all the leaves. So what is an acacia? Well, look below ground for a minute. The root system goes so far, let's say, how many square feet? But attached to the roots of the acacia, first of all, there are nodules that contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria to help it grow. And then there are mycorrhizal fungi, these invisible fungal threads that are thousands of miles of them for one tree. They extend the effective root area by at least 10 times, and they're able to get water and nutrients out of places in the tiny pores of the soil that are too small for even a root hair to get into. And then, I don't know how long I'm rambling on, but in every leaf of the acacia, and I'm just picking acacia randomly, of every green plant, the basis of the food chains, are chloroplasts that do the magic of photosynthesis. That's the app, the magical app that converts sunlight to food. And that is a chloroplast. And a chloroplast, I think a lot of people may know at this point, but it was news until about late 1980s, that chloroplast is a modified cyanobacterium. And that's a symbiosis that started 2.2 million years ago. And then that plant, you, all those people in the picture there, all of us, every animal and plant on Earth operates because we have mitochondria, these other little organelles in our cells. They too are originally bacteria that formed a symbiosis billions of years ago. And so what's an acacia? And then you start asking yourself, well, what's a human? We think of ourselves as individuals. In reality, we're kind of a collaborative creature. We're a compound organism. Everybody is, every plant, every animal. Okay, last part with us people thinking of ourselves. We have the myth of the fact that we're special. We are a separate quality of life. And we're out there trying to fix environmental problems and solve things, but we don't see ourselves the way we are. And we don't see nature the way it is. We see it as survival of the fittest, as part of our competitive view of things. Individual competition, survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw. Yes, evolution works through that, but it also works through collaboration. It also works through the fact that 8% of my genome and yours is of viral origin. Viruses are carrying DNA from species to species and group to group. So it's not just mutations that give rise to differences and evolution acts upon. It come like that with a viral infection. And in this age, we're all thinking about viruses way too much. So I'm gonna move right on from that to say that inside our guts, our mouth, and on our skin are more microbes than there are human cells in and on our body. That's 30 trillion plus. They're bacteria, archaea, yeast, and protozoans. And they're helping us digest. They're fending off pathogenic bacteria. That's us. Most of the DNA in and on our bodies is not ours. Our DNA is a tiny fraction of the whole microbiome. So I guess what I'm trying to say is what nature has to teach us is everything, who we are. It's the big questions in life. Where do we come from? How does it work? And with the modern technology and the advances we have, we're starting to learn this at an exponential rate. Even as, look, when I was at the University of Montana in grad school, there were fewer than half as many people in the world as there are today. And there were twice as many animals. And these are the large, the vertebrate animals we pay attention to. There were more than twice as many. We went up, we doubled, they went down by more than half. And they, the predictions I think are very reasonable. I've made a study of them, that we stand to lose a third to, well, more than a third than all species on the planet, on the only living planet we know. So we better start thinking, I don't want to do an eco sermon, but I mean, we need desperately to start thinking about who we are in relation to nature and the fact that, as the others have pointed out, that we are nature. There's infinite lessons, there's wonder and awe to be had all the way along. And the ultimate thing nature tells me is, hey, you're really lucky to be alive, but know thyself. That's what the study of nature yields. And we don't know ourselves. I don't think we know what nature is. It's a boundless and exciting frontier, but that's, the more answers we have, the better off we're going to be. Healthy biosphere, healthy humans. And at this stage of Earth's history, when we're changing everything from the air to the water to our daily environment, we need to ask the question you guys posed in this forum, which I think is great. What does nature have to teach us? Now, I think I'll leave it at that, but thanks.
Thank you so much, Doug. Again, imagine the applause and give actual applause if you can. So right now is time for Q&A, and Susan will explain more.
That was amazing. I have new respect for termites, actually, too. Thank you. That was really, really amazing, all three of you. And so Q&A is, those of you who are our regular attendees know that Q&A is a critical part of every City Club, important part. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and they'll be forwarded to Nick to pose to our panel. Please keep your questions short and not statementy. But I thought, Nick, you might have questions of your own to start with.
Absolutely. One idea, I think, one thread that goes through all three of your wonderful presentations is this notion that we need to be thinking bigger picture, longer term. And that's one of the main things we can learn from nature. Jakki mentions thinking beyond the stock market, and Doug goes all the way back to us being single-celled organisms and thinking beyond, that we're all a collective and not isolated individuals. How, as individuals, as Montanans, as a society, do we think longer term? Like, how do we do that? How do we make that happen? There are a lot of really, there's coronavirus and really pressing daily things going on. How do we think bigger?
I can jump in on that, Nick, just from the business perspective that I bring. And one of the key issues is that the institutions that drive the economic environment are often pretty far removed from their impacts on the natural world. And as a result, that artificial separation between the decisions and the actions and the impacts means that it's all too easy to overemphasize the financial component as opposed to the environmental component. And so I would say from a business perspective, there are two things going on that will, well, probably more than two, but yeah, I could go on about this. The first one is we need business leaders who are willing to be more courageous about challenging the status quo thinking about the short term. And we do see that. For example, Unilever, one of the biggest corporations in the world, their CEO has said they will no longer be reporting quarterly reports for Wall Street. They will not be driven by the short-term demands of the stock market. And to have executives who are willing to have the courage to stand up to that will start changing the paradigm. The second thing that I would say is, again, business has been governed by financial disclosures with a focus on the bottom line, and they haven't been asked to be accountable for environmental impacts. And that is also changing. For example, we're now seeing new efforts for what are called non-financial disclosures, where companies are reporting their environmental impacts as part of their reporting mechanisms, just like they've reported for financial profit and loss. And as that becomes a regulatory mandate is what many leaders are asking for because it levels the playing field for everybody. I think that I'll stop there with those two, although I'd love to talk about data and technology as well, because those are both near and dear to my heart in terms of more business transparency about environmental impacts.
I'll jump in quick, Nick. I use wildlife movements, big game migrations, that type of thing. Those wildlife movements are at the same scale at which our rural communities flourish and our food supply is sustained. And so don't think about an individual ranch or producer. Don't think about an individual critter. Think about the entire watershed at which those systems operate, and we'll be in much better shape.
Mm-hmm. Anything else to add, Doug?
Yeah, I'm with David on that, and we, just as we think in terms of ourselves as individuals, I think we tend to focus on individual species, save the this, save the that, or individual areas, save Mount Baldy, save Elk Creek, and what David said, everything is way more connected than I think most people appreciate. And I guess for purposes of achieving some goals, we've separated them out, but it reinforces this idea of separation, and what nature is a community. What we see as individuals in nature are tied in infinite number of ways, and if we're not working on a big connected scale, I don't think we can keep up with the threats being posed to them. And we environmentalists always talk in terms of threats, but I think I like to talk more in terms of the wonder, the awe, the beauty, and all the benefits that we gain now and stand to gain more of if we can do some of these things right. I just see life, I'd turn into Pollyanna instead. Like it's going to get better the more we know, the more we understand.
Thank you all for those thoughts. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience, and our first one is for Jakki. So we have someone with a question about internship opportunities in biomimicry, but it makes me think even bigger. How can somebody interested in these ideas about biomimicry get involved in the field, whether finding a company or an internship opportunity, or just getting more involved in it?
There are many universities that are offering programs in biomimicry. For example, at the University of Montana, the climate change study students had a full semester on integrating biomimicry with their climate change through Peter McDonough at the Davidson Honors College. Eric Green, one of the famous bird biologists, has done components on biomimicry in his classes, and I teach a component in my marketing classes as well. From a more technical perspective, engineering schools such as the, golly, I'm drawing a blank, it's in Ohio, I think it might be Cleveland, has a biomedical engineering program where you can actually get a PhD in biomimicry for biomedical design. The Minneapolis College of Art and Design teaches biomimicry. There are textile programs that teach biomimicry for fabrics. So I'd be happy to have people reach out to me. You can find me at the University of Montana website. And if you have particular interests, I can help you at least know what I know in my head about schools where you can get this. But I really can't emphasize enough that the biomimicry.org website is a wealth of information, and they do keep track of programs there. Finally, there are regional networks around the world. There's Biomimicry Europa, Biomimicry South Africa, Biomimicry Chile. And if you go on social media, Facebook primarily, no matter where you are in the world, you can find a biomimicry network to join for these kinds of courses and experiences.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. There's tons of opportunities, turns out. Our next question comes from Bob Kiesling. And before I get into that, though, I just want to remind folks, if you do have questions to ask them, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom right-hand side, just under the speakers where you can see, and just type it on in there. But this question comes from Bob, and it says, this question is for David. It says, is there an accessible database you can refer to that inventories private lands conserved to date? So like, how do we keep track of how much private land is being conserved and where?
Great question. The answer, curiously, if it's through the Farm Bill, for most programs is no. And the one word answer would be privacy. And so it's actually legislated into the federal Farm Bill not to disclose that publicly. And I think it's largely because producers in rural communities are very private people. They don't always want their neighbor to know that they're partnering with the government for larger societal benefits like conservation. I suppose it'd be like someone coming into your business and just expecting you to open up your books to them. And so, no, not right now. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't assess effectiveness of things like the Sage Grouse Initiative and Working Lands for Wildlife approaches. And so it's actually part of my job at the university to assess effectiveness of conservation outcomes. And so before we would always report outputs. So you might be in the audience today. Go back to pinyon juniper management, the tree encroachment into grazing lands. And I would come on the screen and say, hey, I'm working with the Farm Bill, and we cut out, we're at about 1 million acres of pinyon juniper management. I'm clapping in my head. You're in the audience going, well, is that good or not? What we do is take the locations where that management has been done, and I ran a 10-year radio mark sage grouse project in those watersheds, and the findings are a 12% increase in population growth rate for sage grouse. That's an outcome, not an output. And you go, oh, in fact, this is one of the only management strategies documented where instead of just holding the line and not having populations continue to decline, we can actually turn a population around and have a positive input. So can anybody get their hands on what a private rancher is doing day to day? No. Do we know the effectiveness of these co-produced investments? Absolutely.
Super interesting. Doug, go for it.
Well, I think if it's the Bob Kiesling I know, he's already aware of this, but I wanted to make other people aware. There is MALT, the Montana Association of Land Trusts. And they have good numbers for the acreage protected through various land trusts on private land through conservation agreements. And that's somewhat different than David's talking about, where these large scale management changes can be negotiated with ranchers, but these are people that have made an agreement with the land trust to give up certain development rights for the sake of the ecosystem or wildlife or certain species on their land. And that is a huge and growing trend. And Montana's been a leader in it. I think per capita, we are the state with the most such agreements. So I'll leave it at that. But looking
I gotta jump in, Nick. Fun fact for Montana. In the last 2 years, Montana just finished its 230,000 acre of permanent conservation easements, largely in eastern Montana, to protect those big migratory populations of sage grouse and pronghorn. In fact, Montana alone in the last 2 years has used 25% of the entire easement budget nationally out of the Farm Bill. One state using 25% of it. That's Montana's commitment to big sky country and large and open spaces.
That's fascinating. Just to back up and make sure everybody's on board, what exactly is, what do you mean when you say these big conservation easements? What is it? What is an easement?
Highly targeted, voluntary incentive based with a producer, where the landowner has a vision for their family, where they want that to be a large and intact working ranch in perpetuity. In return for part of a payment one time for the value of that ranch, they then say, I will not make this large and intact sagebrush habitat a wheat field. I won't subdivide it and turn it into housing. It's these big threats that are taken off the table forever. And literally that deed, that easement is attached to the deed at the courthouse. And so even if that land is sold or passed on to the next generation, that conservation agreement stays in place. We have never lost in court a conservation easement question like that. It's a great tool in our toolbox.
Interesting. All right, let's go to another question. This one comes from John Pillsworth, and it is for Jakki, but of course, anybody else feel free to chime in too. How is biomimicry used to combat the climate change? How does it interact with the climate crisis?
That's a really important question. Biomimicry typically breaks challenges down into specific questions that can be informed by specific organisms, processes, ecosystems. So climate change is so huge that I would ask, would you like to focus on the fossil fuel energy conundrum? Would you like to focus on the agricultural offputs into greenhouse gas and methane gas? Would you like to focus on the productions of plastics? Would you like to focus on refrigeration? There are so many contributors to the climate crisis, and biomimicry requires breaking each one down so that we can learn from a specific organism in nature about how to redesign that particular problem. And so if you, again, Google is your friend here. If you Google biomimicry plus climate change, because climate crisis is a fairly new lexicon, it previously has been called climate change, you will find that in 2018, the Biomimicry Institute had a global design challenge about nature-inspired inventions to reverse, mitigate, or adapt to climate change. And you can read about the award-winning teams there that qualified for the $100,000 Ray Anderson Ray of Hope Prize. And so definitely biomimicry can be used to address these challenges and is being used to address these challenges. It's just that it has to be at a scale where there's an actual organism or ecosystem that we can learn from, and then design a solution to address that particular problem or challenge. And I really want to say how much I respect Dave and Doug's contributions about thinking about the awe and wonder of nature. I think that is one reason that biomimicry has been so appealing to a certain subset of businesses. It is our own human ingenuity that has created the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. And I put ingenuity in air quotes because clearly we're not the geniuses we think we are if we're driving the planet into, an implosion perspective. And so part of biomimicry is really being open to nature's wisdom and to quiet our ostensible human genius to listen to nature's genius so that we can actually learn from what would be probably a more sustainable future for all of us if we could be part of nature instead of the dominant force.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me like climate change has intersections with much of what David and Doug talked about as well. So I'd love to open the door to hear both of them talk about what climate means for, say, private lands conservation or sage grouse, and even thinking bigger about our relationship with nature. Like this question of what we can learn from nature, I think definitely has a lot to bear with climate change. So David or Doug, would you like to add anything?
I'll take a swing. Yeah, I mean, a vote for grassland and sagebrush conservation is a vote for climate mitigation. So imagine the plant structure of a perennial deep-rooted plant. There's some above ground, but if you can be a soil microbe and look below ground, those roots run feet deep. And that is where much of the carbon is stored in a prairie or a sagebrush plant. It's when we cultivate those that carbon is put up into the atmosphere. We're just going to watch in real time right now. We really don't have the carbon markets figured out, but I'm betting ranching can play a role in those, and credit markets. I'm sure that up in the High Line, linking back to the previous conversation, the Nature Conservancy just closed their first conservation easement in which part of the payment actually came from a carbon credit market from a grassland perspective. So this is all going to show itself over the next 10, 20 years. Thanks.
Yeah. Go ahead, Doug, you're muted.
I had a barking dog, so I'm muted. I just wanted to add one sentence to what Jakki said about looking to nature and the way we value it relative to our own self-congratulatory genius. I think every creature that exists out there, from invisible to elephantine, is the right answer to the question of what's the best way to live on this planet. You know, it's been shaped by those same millions of years that shaped us. It's been tested, and that's what I love about the biomimicry is all these solutions to how best to live on the planet, and an infinite variety and more species. There are what, 8, Jakki, 8 million to as many as 100 million different species. I've seen different estimates. It depends, of course, on how small down the size scale you're counting, but that's a lot of solutions out there. And I'll bet the more we look, the more we're going to be able to adapt.
So, I'm curious, one thing we're hearing a lot about right now is a population boom in lots of Montana, and, Rivergeddon or COVID refugees coming to Montana. How do we reconcile this growth in population with the natural heritage here in the state? Anybody want to take it?
No, I want to run out the door screaming.
I'll take a swing, Nick. Here's the answer. You're not going to stop them from coming because they all want to live the awesome life that we live in Montana. Here's one thing we can do. We can be more intentional in our targeting of conservation so that in 100 years, when you pull up a satellite imagery and you go, look at that unbelievable watershed, like the Blackfoot Valley north of us, they got on top of conservation early. They did it at big ridgetop to ridgetop scales. And that place looks different. When I bring somebody where I live, I take them up there and they go, I knew you guys were living better than we were. They did it right. They did it big. They did it awesome. It was built bottom up through the community. And that's great. We need to replicate those kinds of landowner-led groups and support them so that we have those special places in the future and we don't experience everywhere a death by 1,000 cuts.
And just to be super specific, those groups you're referencing here specifically are like the Blackfoot Challenge, is that right?
Blackfoot Challenge, they're all throughout the West, the Malpai borderlands. Yeah, there's, I speak next week in the evening with Ranchers Stewardship Alliance that had so much to do with the conservation easements that Doug spoke about. They're there, but they could use more help and more support so that they could scale up this landscape conservation approach.
And Nick, I'll just chime in on this as well. Although I am a researcher of companies that use biomimicry, and I don't consider myself a biomimicry, expert in terms of solutions and the biology component, I am aware of the huge impact that biomimicry has had on architecture and building design. So if those people are going to be coming here, one thing we could ask is for our building industry to be more attentive to building design that is in harmony with nature. A very large architectural company that builds huge complex buildings like air terminals, for example, is HOK Architects, and their practice is positioned on being in harmony with the ecosystems in which those buildings are made. So that Daniel Inouye, I think it's a weather center in Hawaii, has won awards. They're building in California. They've won awards for their commercial buildings in California. And so we could adopt a similar approach for more harmony with our natural environment. Similarly, there are studies of city design and city layout that creates a design planning that is more in harmony with nature. So a trend right now in biomimicry is designing to what are called environmental performance standards. And so if we have a certain amount of environmental benefit that's coming from the ability of the soil to absorb rainwater and snow melt, or the ability of the waters to support our fisheries. Those would be environmental performance metrics that we need to make sure are maintained in the future. And so building and designing with these environmental performance standards in mind, sometimes called ecosystem services, would be another way to ensure that we are designing to be in harmony with nature.
Nick?
Go ahead.
Yeah. You in the audience in Missoula, you have two really good land trusts locally. One, and most people may know them, but one is Five Valleys Land Trust. The other is Vital Ground Foundation. And I've helped found the Vital Ground Foundation years ago, but we've gone from, as a lot of conservation groups have, gone from saving this area, saving that area, saving that spot, that habitat, to connecting them. And the great thing about Montana is all the public lands we have and the degree of protection many of them have. And as David was pointing out, if that can be combined with private land conservation, And so everyone's making connectivity maps. How do you get the Bitterroots connected to the sapphires? How do you get that connected to the Bob Marshall Wilderness as you go north? There are routes, there are drawn out property evaluations. If we can get this place, and that place, we'll have a route for everything from grizzly bears to lynx to songbirds. So anyway, look into those two groups. That's something right at hand and go learn more about on your own.
Yeah, that stuff's super fascinating and important. And I mean, there are tons of other groups focused on large landscape conservation
Yep.
too, like the Center for Large Landscape Conservation.
Yeah.
And Yellowstone to Yukon. And
Yeah.
and you know, one thing that makes Montana so unique is how much intact ecosystem we have, and the potential we have to make that even stronger and larger. I'm curious though, Doug, I mentioned early on your upcoming book, 4/5 of Grizzly. Could you tell us a little more about what that is and when to expect it?
Well, it's some of the things I talked about, but it's interesting. This feeds right into what you just said. Two of the chapters, it's about how we think about nature. It's about how nature works, but it's then, oh, great, what do I do? Just like people are asking now. And one chapter in it is about island conservation. About nearly 80% of the extinctions that have taken place on Earth since 1500 have been on oceanic islands because they're vulnerable. And another chapter is on Yellowstone to Yukon because what's happening as the human population and technology and developments expand is the areas we've protected that were de facto wild lands in between them before are now becoming islands within a sea of development. And that's what this connectivity is all about. And so I didn't, how to describe the book? It occurred to me that I just might not live long enough to do books on every species on the planet. I've been looking at things like mountain goats and goby bears and whales and so on. So it does come down to how we think about nature, and a lot of what's happening to nature, the doom and gloom gang jumps on it, and rightly so. But I think people desperately want to know what they can do to help. And it is easy to get involved. And if that's combined with thinking about nature a bit differently than we have before, and connectivity, large landscapes, I'm glad you mentioned those groups. There are a lot of others, but I think things are turning in that direction. And I think we've got more than a good shot at it, especially in places like Montana, with still a relatively small population in relation to the size of the wild country out there, and the vigor, the intactness of the wildlife populations, plant and animal populations. I think Yellowstone to Yukon, one of the most intact left on the face of the planet anymore. So.
Yeah, and when is it due? When is the book going to come out?
Well, it was supposed to be March, slipped into April. It may not be till May. Thank you very much, COVID. Everyone's working from home half time, trying to get things done. But I'm pretty antsy to see that thing come out, and hope it does some good, of course.
That's great. So I've got one more question for you, and if we have time, which we may not, I'd love to hear questions you have for each other too. But before we do that, so much of what we talk about when we talk about nature is doomsaying, like I think Doug said earlier. And we've mentioned some bright spots, some room for hope. But what else gives you hope and makes you optimistic about our future? I'm just going to go in order. Let's go Jakki first, if that's all right.
Yeah, for me personally, I just am so inspired by our ability as a society to really start building some interdisciplinary bridges, because I think the melding and merging of different areas of expertise is key to the future. And so for me, the fact that I'm working with restoration ecologists and with biologists, and I don't consider myself an aberration as a business person in being concerned about nature. There are many groups right now that are being formed. There's Montana Business for the Outdoors. There's an international group called Business for Nature. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has a business group. And so from my lens, I'm just really hopeful that as we get more science and knowledge about how to solve these problems, that a big focus can be on scaling those solutions up, which requires understanding human behavior and human change. And this is where marketing people have had a really big advantage over the years, because we know a lot about human behavior and change in human behavior. So the interdisciplinarity and the interest in business, not all business, but many businesses as being part of the solution, leaves me feeling hopeful.
Thank you. David, what about you?
Yeah, I'm glass half full. You give up on nature, you give up on ourselves. And so I'm going to hang my hat on technology. If you're holding your smartphone, go to rangelands.app. And we created the Rangeland Analysis Platform in the last 2 years, where we took all of the satellite imagery, flew out to the Silicon, struck up a deal with Google, and we used artificial intelligence to classify all of that satellite imagery for rangelands in the western half of the nation. And for the first time now, we don't have to stare at our boots and do piecemeal conservation. You have that big picture through time and space to see what's going on and get hugely intentional with our approaches to conservation of nature.
I'm going to check out rangeland.app as soon as we log off of this call.
All right.
That sounds amazingly fascinating. Doug, what about you?
Oh, I'd just say, I think all of us who practice conservation have all long ago made a pact with ourselves to be willful optimists. You can choose to moan and groan, and you're going to turn more people off than encourage. And there are plenty of good projects being done. I'm also on a board that works internationally. And I'm not going to get into details of the projects, but these, if you keep that optimism, and we can not have too high an expectation in the near term, but at the rate, as the others have said, the rate technology is changing and the way attitudes are changing. And again, what we learn from nature, what nature can teach us, we start to take that more to heart. If we can hold the line now, that maybe is my generation's job. And then others can build on it and even restore more of it, make those connections, make a parallel world between what humans are doing, but with room for all of nature's regimes to flow and populations to migrate and adapt to changing conditions and all the things they need. Is perfectly possible if we can plan it. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for those amazing, amazing thoughts. We have less than a minute left, I believe. So I will turn it over to Susan to close things out.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thanks to all you willful optimists for educating us and giving us hope and giving us things that we can do to feel more empowered, which is so important. Thank you, as always, to our sponsors, especially Blackfoot First Security Bank and the University of Montana. Thanks to our audience. Again, a final thank you to our amazing panelists and moderator. Please join us on Monday, February 8th via Zoom for a forum on COVID-19 1 year later. Until then, Happy New Year. Thanks again and have a good rest of your day.